The first time Elowen Hart tried to open the pottery studio after the second anniversary of Miles's death, the door refused her like a living thing that had learned grief from her hands. It was a wet Portland morning, not dramatic enough for lightning, not cruel enough for wind, only a steady gray rain that darkened the concrete path behind the house and made the swollen wooden frame of the studio door press hard into itself. Elowen stood beneath the narrow awning with the hood of her coat pulled low, her fingers stiff around the key, listening to rain drip from the gutter into the cracked ceramic bowl Miles had once placed there as a joke because the downspout leaked, and he said even bad plumbing deserved handmade dignity. The bowl was still there, half full of brown rainwater and maple leaves. Everything was still there. That was the problem. Through the dusty square of glass in the studio door, she could see the edge of the old work table, the wheel covered with a stained canvas cloth, the kiln standing cold against the far wall, the shelves with half-finished pieces that had gone from unfinished to abandoned to sacred, simply because the man who had meant to finish them never came home. Miles's apron hung on the peg beside the sink, stiff with dried clay and white dust, one strap twisted exactly the way it had been the week before the accident. Elowen had not touched it. For 2 years she had told herself that restraint was love. She had told herself she was preserving him, preserving them, preserving the last honest shape of a life that had ended too abruptly to be rearranged. But standing there with the key refusing to turn, she felt for one sharp second that maybe the room was not preserved at all. Maybe it was sealed. Maybe she had not kept Miles alive inside it. Maybe she had locked both of them in. She tried the key again, harder this time, and the wood groaned but did not open. The sound went through her chest with such strange force that she almost apologized aloud to the door, as if pressure itself were a kind of betrayal. She had not come to work. She had not come to make anything. She had come because Vivian Hart wanted the cracked blue cup for the memorial table at church. The cup Miles had made in their first winter as a married couple, the one with the glaze fault running down one side like a pale river. Vivian wanted it beside the framed photograph and the same white candle and the same poem they had read the year before, because Vivian believed repetition kept her son from slipping farther away. Elowen had said yes before she felt the cost of it. She was good at saying yes to the dead, and to the people who loved them. The door resisted again. She leaned her forehead against the wet frame and closed her eyes. Behind her, from the gravel drive, a truck door shut quietly. She turned too fast, caught off guard by the presence of another human being in the private weather of her mourning. Rowan Bell stood near the gate with a dark wool coat buttoned over a work shirt, a wooden toolbox in one hand, rain silvering his hair at the temples. He was not handsome in the way that made a room adjust itself. He looked sturdy, weathered, calm without trying to perform calm. He looked at the door, then at her, and did not offer the immediate sad half-smile people gave when they recognized her name. The widow. The potter's wife, the one whose husband died in the crash on Highway 26 during the Winter Craft Fair week. Instead, he set the toolbox down on the concrete and said, "The property manager said the back studio door was jammed." Elowen wiped rain from her cheek with the back of her hand. "It swells when the weather turns. Most old doors do." He crouched near the frame and looked at the lower hinge. "Do you want it opened clean? Or do you just need it open today?" The question startled her because it gave her a choice without dramatizing it. She looked past him at the cedar fence Miles had patched badly, and promised to redo properly in spring, except spring had arrived without him. Then another spring, then another. "Do not break the door," she said too quickly. "My husband built it." Rowan's hand paused near the hinge. He did not say he was sorry. He did not ask when. He did not look at her face to measure how much pain his silence should contain. He only nodded once. "Then I will open it the slow way." That was how Rowan Bell entered Elowen's life. Not with comfort, not with rescue, not with the bright violence of someone determined to make her better, but with a chisel, a plane, a rag for the rain, and the patience to open a swollen door without damaging what a dead man's hands had made. For 2 years after Miles died, Elowen had lived in a house that did not breathe so much as remember. It was not messy, not in the way people imagined grief made rooms messy. There were no piles of dishes turning sour in the sink, no heaps of laundry, no dramatic evidence of collapse. She had always been orderly, and sorrow had not taken that from her. If anything, it had made her more precise. Miles's boots stayed by the back door, with dried earth in the treads from the morning before the fair. His dark green jacket hung on the chair in the kitchen, because he had thrown it there after loading boxes into the van, telling her he would hang it properly when he came back, and she had rolled her eyes because he never hung things properly until she complained twice. His favorite mug, The brown one with the thumb dent, he said, made coffee taste more personal. Sat upside down beside the sink for months before June finally washed it while Elowen was sleeping on the couch, and then cried because Elowen woke and looked at the empty spot as if a second death had occurred. After that, no one touched anything without asking. The house learned her rules. The left side of the closet remained full. The bottle of cedar soap in the shower stayed half-used. The playlist called Kiln Nights remained on the old speaker in the studio, though she had not pressed play since the week of the funeral. Miles's phone sat in the top drawer of the nightstand, dead most of the time. But sometimes Elowen charged it just enough to check whether there was anything she had missed, and because the cruelty of modern devices is that they keep faith with calendars longer than the body keeps life, notifications still appeared. Pick up clay from supplier. Call Silas about booth setup. Dinner with L. No work talk. The first time she saw that last reminder after the funeral, she had sat on the bedroom floor until afternoon, the phone in her lap, unable to decide whether to delete it or obey it. People said she was strong because she answered messages, paid bills, returned to part-time work at the arts library, and did not fall apart in grocery store aisles where strangers could see. They did not see how many mornings she made 2 cups of coffee and poured one away after it cooled. They did not see her stand in the studio doorway at night without going in. They did not see the way she avoided buying new soap because Miles's scent fading from the bathroom felt like abandonment done by molecules. They did not see how she had turned the house into a museum and then made herself both curator and prisoner. Miles had not been a saint when he was alive, and in the beginning that truth had saved her from worship. He had been warm, funny, impulsive, stubborn about money, careless with invoices, tender with injured birds, impatient with slow drivers, and incapable of remembering where he put packing tape. He had loved Elowen in ordinary physical ways, bringing her coffee with clay still on his wrists, kissing the back of her neck while she trimmed bowls, making up names for failed glaze experiments, arguing about whether they could afford a second kiln, then leaving apology notes on bags of clay. They had fought the week before he died because he wanted to expand the studio classes before they had enough savings. Elowen had said he treated risk like romance. Miles had said she treated fear like wisdom. They had gone to bed turned away from each other, then reached for each other in the dark because anger had never lasted long enough to sleep between them. After he died, those sharp edges became unbearable. She polished them away in memory not because she wanted to lie, but because the dead cannot defend their imperfections, and she feared that remembering frustration would reduce love. So she remembered the best parts until Miles became gentler in absence than he had ever been in life. The tragedy was that the real Miles had been easier to love than the perfect ghost. The real Miles would have laughed at the shrine she had made of his boots. The ghost demanded silence. Rowan took 2 days to open the studio properly. On the first day, he shaved the swollen edge of the door in slow curls that fell pale onto the wet threshold, tightened the lower hinge, and told her the frame had shifted because water had been getting into the seam for years. Elowen stood nearby, arms crossed, trying not to look like she was watching him touch a body. He asked before moving anything. "May I lift this?" he said before shifting the clay-stained stool. "Is this shelf safe to lean on?" before testing the rotten bracket. When his hand moved near the apron, Elowen inhaled too sharply and he stopped before she said a word. "Not that," she said, ashamed of her own voice. He nodded and moved to the window. He did not make her explain the apron. He did not tell her objects were just objects. By noon, rain had softened into mist, and the studio smelled like old clay, damp wood dust, and a faint metallic cold from the kiln. Elowen had forgotten how physical the room was. Grief had turned it into an idea, but entering it again made her remember the body of it, the grit beneath her shoes, the shelf wobble, the dried slip in the sink drain, the way light came in through the high window and struck the wheel. She took 3 steps inside and had to grip the table because the sight of Miles's stool, slightly crooked, undid her more than the funeral had. At the funeral, he had been gone in a way everyone agreed upon. Here, absence looked interrupted. Rowan remained at the door, one hand resting on the frame. He did not come closer. That restraint was almost worse than comfort. It gave her no one to perform for. She could neither reassure him nor collapse into being held. She had to stand inside the room with the truth of her own knees. "I only need the cup," she said, though no one had asked. "For Vivian." Rowan's eyes moved to the shelves. "Tell me which one." She pointed to the blue cup on the second shelf, the crack visible even through dust. Rowan did not reach for it. He stepped aside so she could. It took Elowen a full minute to cross the room. Her hand trembled when she lifted the cup, and a tiny line of dust marked the place it had occupied for 2 years. She stared at that clean oval on the shelf, absurdly wounded by proof that even untouched things leave evidence of having been moved. Rowan said, very quietly, "I can come back tomorrow to finish the weather strip." She nodded, still looking at the shelf. He packed his tools without clatter. At the door, he paused only long enough to say, "Wood that stays closed too long swells around the closing. It does not mean it is ruined." Elowen looked at him then. "Are you talking about the door?" "Mostly," he said, and left before the sentence could become advice. That evening, she placed the cracked blue cup in the center of the kitchen table, and did not touch it again until midnight. It looked smaller outside the studio, less mystical, almost embarrassingly domestic, a flawed cup that could not hold water without weeping along the fracture. Miles had loved it because he said it looked like a mistake that refused shame. Vivian loved it because Miles had touched it. Elowen loved it because it belonged to a winter when they were broke, freezing, half scared, and still laughing at bad clay. She ran one finger along the crack and remembered Miles holding it up to the light, pretending to be a museum guide. "Here we see the early Hart period," he had said, "marked by poverty, overconfidence, and the artist's tragic inability to center the damp clay." She had thrown a sponge at him. He had ducked. The sponge had hit the wall and left a crescent of gray slip that remained for months, because neither of them remembered to clean it. Sitting alone with the cup, she felt the memory sharpen into something unbearable, because it contained not only love, but sound, mess, movement. The cup had once been part of a room where things went wrong and people kept working. Now it sat like evidence that wrongness could be worshipped if someone died at the right time. The next morning she took it to the church wrapped in a towel, and Vivian received it with both hands, her face softening in a way that made Elowen feel both useful and trapped. Vivian Hart's memorials were beautiful in the way controlled grief often becomes beautiful when it does not know where else to go. The small church hall smelled of lilies, candle wax, and coffee in metal urns. The same framed photograph of Miles stood on the same linen cloth as the year before. Miles in a flannel shirt, grinning with one eye narrowed against the sun, a streak of blue glaze across his cheek. The cracked cup sat beside the photograph, placed carefully by Vivian herself, who touched its rim as if taking a pulse. Vivian was 61, slim, silver-haired, always dressed as though someone might arrive unexpectedly with news requiring dignity. Losing Miles, her only child, had not made her wild, it had made her exact. She remembered who sent flowers, who wrote, who did not call on the anniversary, who said passed away and who said died. She loved Elowen with real tenderness, and that tenderness had weight. Vivian held Elowen's hand too long when greeting guests. She introduced her as our Elowen, which once would have warmed her and now made her feel gently nailed to the family. "The cup looks right there," Vivian whispered as people took seats. Miles always liked when things had a flaw. He said the flaw gave the glaze somewhere to tell the truth. Elowen nodded because the words were beautiful, and because Miles had said them, though probably while trying to convince a customer to buy a defective mug. Vivian looked at her black dress. "I am glad you wore this one again." Elowen's stomach tightened. She had almost worn a blue blouse that morning, then changed because she could not bear Vivian's eyes discovering color on her before she was ready to defend it. "It seemed appropriate," she said. Vivian exhaled softly, relieved. That little breath was worse than a demand. Demands could be resisted. Relief made obedience feel merciful. During the memorial, Vivian read the same poem, her voice steady until the last line. Arthur Hart sat beside her, large hands folded, his face weathered and quiet. Arthur had been a clock repairman before retirement, the kind of man who could spend 3 hours adjusting a mechanism by a fraction of a fraction, and call it a decent morning. Since Miles's death, he had spoken less, but his silences did not grip the room the way Vivian's did. They left space. After the service, Vivian asked whether the studio remained as Miles left it. Elowen said yes, though the door now opened and the cup had been moved and the air in the room had shifted. Vivian closed her eyes briefly, and for one painful moment she looked less like a mother preserving memory than a woman standing on a shore watching the last piece of wreckage float within reach. "Thank you," she said. "I know people think it is strange, but I just cannot bear the idea of him disappearing from every place at once." Elowen could have said he is already gone. She could have said I am disappearing too. Instead, she squeezed Vivian's hand and became again the kind of widow other people could survive. The afternoon stretched long because grief made people linger around stale cookies and coffee, as if leaving too soon were disrespectful to the dead. A woman from the old craft fair committee told Elowen that Miles had once repaired her booth sign in the rain with wire and a grin. A man from the clay supplier said, he was one of the good ones, as though goodness were rare enough to explain death. Someone asked whether Elowen was still making pottery, and before she could answer, Vivian said, not yet, with a soft firmness that turned Elowen's silence into family policy. Not yet. The phrase landed like a shawl over her shoulders, kind, warm, suffocating. Arthur glanced at her, and for one brief second she thought he might say something. He did not. He rubbed his thumb over his wedding band and looked at the cup. On the drive home, Elowen stopped at a red light and realized she had been clenching her jaw so hard that her teeth hurt. Rain blurred the windshield. On the passenger seat, Vivian had left a small packet of leftover memorial cards for Elowen to keep. Miles's face smiled from the top card. She wanted to throw them out the window. She wanted to kiss them. She drove home with them beside her, hating the fact that both impulses were love. June Sato was the first person who loved Elowen enough to let herself be resented. She owned a bakery 3 blocks from the arts library, a narrow storefront that smelled of butter, cardamom, burned sugar, and the bitter coffee she drank black because she said milk made everything too hopeful. June had stood beside Elowen at the funeral, handled food deliveries, answered messages, washed the brown mug, and endured Elowen's silence without turning it into a test of friendship. A week after the memorial, she locked the bakery after closing, and made Elowen sit at the metal prep table while she slid a small pear tart onto a plate. You do not have to eat it, June said. Just look at something that came out of an oven today. Elowen gave a tired laugh. That is a strange prescription. It is less strange than living with a dead man's boots by the door for 2 years. Elowen's face closed. June saw it and did not retreat. I am not being cruel. It sounds like you are practicing. June leaned her hip against the counter. Maybe I am practicing telling the truth without making it soft enough for you to ignore. Elowen looked at the tart until the glazed fruit blurred. The studio door is fixed. Good. That does not mean anything. Doors usually mean something. Elowen pushed the plate away. I needed the cup for Vivian, and after that, I closed it again. June folded her arms. Of course you did. Anger rose because anger was easier than the grief beneath it. You think I should just open everything? Throw his things in boxes? Start teaching classes? Date the carpenter? Is that the healthy widow checklist? June's expression flickered at Rowan's mention, but she did not take the bait. I think you keep saying not yet because you are waiting for a day when living will not feel like betrayal. I am telling you that day may not come before you choose it. Elowen stood so fast the chair scraped the floor. I am not betraying anyone. June's voice softened, but not enough to let her escape. Then why do you live like every new breath needs Miles's permission? Elowen left without taking the tart. Outside, rain had stopped, and the pavement shone under streetlights. She walked home too quickly, furious at June, furious at herself, furious at the little part of her that had noticed Rowan's hands when he sanded the door, and then punished her for noticing anything alive. The anger lasted until she reached her front steps. Then it collapsed, and she stood under the porch light that Miles had installed crookedly, breathing hard, unable to unlock the door because inside waited the boots, the jacket, the phone, the mug, the rooms that no longer knew how to receive her unless she entered as a caretaker. She wanted to call June and apologize. She wanted June to apologize first. She wanted Miles to open the door and make the whole fight irrelevant. Instead, she went inside, placed the leftover memorial cards in a drawer, and washed a single cup for tea. Later that night, she dreamed she was in the studio with Miles, but the studio was full of church flowers, lilies arranged on every shelf, petals falling into bowls and clogging the wheel. Miles was trying to speak through the glass door. She could see his mouth move. She could not hear him because Vivian was reading the memorial poem behind her, over and over, and June was outside holding the pear tart, saying, "Eat something from today." Elowen woke with her pillow damp and the taste of metal in her mouth. In the morning she went to work at the arts library, where she reshelved books on ceramic history and helped a teenage girl find a book about portrait drawing. The girl, a quiet kid named Lila who had once taken a workshop with Miles, said, "Did you ever open the clay place again?" Elowen froze with a stack of returned books in her arms. Lila flushed. "Sorry. My mom said not to ask." Elowen forced a smile. "It is all right. Mr. Miles said my pinch pots looked like potatoes but good potatoes." The memory arrived so unexpectedly that Elowen almost laughed and cried at once. "That sounds like him." Lila looked down. "I liked being there." After the girl left, Elowen stood between the shelves, holding a book on ancient vessels, and felt the first faint anger that did not point at June, Vivian, Rowan, or herself. It pointed at the closed studio. Not because the room had failed Miles, but because it had stopped giving anything to anyone else. Rowan returned the next week because the old shelf near the kiln was rotted through and one of Miles's unfinished bowls had cracked when the bracket sagged. Elowen had called the property manager and then regretted it immediately, as if repairs were a series of insults. Rowan arrived with cedar planks and a quieter toolbox than seemed possible for a carpenter. They worked in the studio with the door propped open to let in pale afternoon air. Elowen wore Miles's old apron because she had taken it down to shake out the dust and then could not bring herself to leave it on the peg. It hung awkwardly over her sweater, too broad in the chest, the ties wrapped twice around her waist. Rowan noticed but did not comment. He measured twice, marked the wall, asked where each object should go before lifting it. When he picked up a small green bowl with a warped rim, Elowen said, "Not that shelf." He set it down immediately. "Here? No, sorry. Yes. I do not know." Her face burned. Rowan rested the bowl on the table and stepped back. "You do not have to know quickly." She looked at him, irritated by the kindness because it did not demand anything she could refuse. "Everything in here is complicated. Most rooms that matter are." He sanded the edge of a plank, and the smell of cedar moved through the old clay air. For a while they worked without speaking. Then he picked up the cracked blue cup's dust ring on the shelf with his eyes not touching the spot and said, "Was he the potter?" "We both were." The answer came out sharper than intended. Rowan nodded. "Then I will stop assuming." Elowen looked down. "People usually do. They remember Miles because he was louder, he sold better, he loved talking to customers. I made half the pieces people bought and then stood behind him while he made them laugh." She had not meant to say that. The words seemed to startle the room. Rowan continued fitting the shelf bracket. "That sounds lonely." It was not. But even as she said it, memory argued, it had not been lonely in the way widowhood was lonely. It had been the ordinary loneliness of loving someone with more light in public than in paperwork, more imagination than discipline, more charm than follow-through. She had been happy. She had also been tired. Both things had been true, and after Miles died she had allowed only one to remain. Rowan tightened a screw. A thing can be loved and heavy. Elowen hated how much that sentence felt like permission. When he finished, she paid him, and he accepted without making her feel indebted. At the door he said, "If you ever reopen the kiln, have someone check the vent first. 2 years is a long sleep for machinery." She almost said she was not reopening anything. Instead, she said, "I will remember." That night she stood in the bathroom and looked at herself wearing Miles's apron. The woman in the mirror looked like someone impersonating a life she had already lost. She untied the apron slowly, buried her face in the stiff fabric, and did not know whether she was crying because it still smelled faintly of clay, or because it no longer smelled like him. Over the following days, she found excuses to enter the studio without calling it entering. She opened the door to check moisture. She moved one bowl because it was too close to the edge. She wiped the window ledge because dust was bad for wood. She did not turn on the light at first. She let gray daylight decide how much of the room could be seen. Each small act felt like trespassing and maintenance at once. One afternoon she found a grocery list in Miles's handwriting tucked under a bag of plaster. "Eggs, tape, coffee, oranges, ask Elle if we are out of oatmeal." That last line undid her because it contained no poetry, no final wisdom, no message from beyond the veil. It was marriage in its smallest form, one person counting on another to know the pantry. She held the paper and realized the things she had treated as sacred were not always the things that best contained him. The sacred could be a stupid list, a joke in the margin, a broken shelf he had forgotten to fix. Miles had not lived in the stillness she had built. He had lived in movement, mess, interruption, unfinished plans. The room, as she kept it, was becoming less like Miles every month. The first time Rowan made her laugh, Elowen felt the laugh leave her body like evidence of a crime. He was repairing the studio window frame, telling her about an old farmhouse restoration where he had accidentally locked himself inside a chicken coop while trying to fix a sagging door. The client said the hens were gentle, he said, planing a narrow strip of wood. That was propaganda. They had military organization. Elowen laughed before she could stop herself. It was not a polite breath or a sad little smile. It was full, sudden, alive, and it rang against the studio walls in a way sound had not done for 2 years. The moment it happened, she looked at Miles' apron, now washed and hanging cleaner than before, and the laugh died in her throat. Rowan's hand slowed. He did not smile triumphantly as people sometimes did when they thought they had gifted the grieving a moment of normalcy. He simply continued working, giving the laugh no audience to become ashamed before. That restraint nearly broke her. That evening she took a shower so hot, the mirror fogged completely and stood under the water with one hand pressed to her mouth. She remembered laughing with Miles on the studio floor, after an entire tray of mugs collapsed because he had stacked them like an optimist, and she had warned him like a pessimist, and they both ended up covered in clay. She remembered him saying, "If we ever become serious artists, promise me you will trip me." She remembered how ordinary joy had been when it was not being measured against death. Then she remembered Rowan's story, the stupid hens, the way his eyes had gone warm when she laughed but not hungry, not claiming. Shame moved through her with the force of nausea. It was not that she believed Miles would be angry. The real Miles would have laughed too. But the ghost she had built from guilt stood sternly in the doorway of every new feeling. The next day Rowan asked if she wanted to get dinner after they finished the window, and he asked it as though no answer would wound him. "Not a date if that makes it easier," he said, wiping sawdust from his sleeve. "Just food in a place where neither of us has to hold tools." Elowen almost said no. Instead she said yes, then spent an hour at home deciding whether to wear her wedding ring. She had not removed it for more than a few minutes in 2 years. She slid it off, placed it on the dresser, walked into the hallway, turned back, picked it up and put it in her coat pocket. At the restaurant, a small place with yellow lamps and mushroom soup, she kept her hand in her pocket around the ring until the edge pressed a crescent into her palm. Rowan talked about restoring old houses, about how people often wanted history preserved but inconvenience removed, which rarely worked because history lived in the inconvenient parts. Elowen told him about glaze faults and the way a kiln could ruin an entire batch by cooling too fast. The conversation felt easy, and that ease frightened her more than desire would have. When the server asked whether they wanted dessert to share, Elowen's body went rigid. Share. The word was too intimate, too casual, too alive. She said she needed to go. In the truck, Rowan did not demand explanation. At her house, before she opened the door, he said, "I like being with you, but I do not want to become a place you go so you do not have to be alone with grief." She turned, stung. "You think I am using you?" "No, I think grief teaches people to grab for warmth and call it direction. I have done it." He looked out at the wet street. "My brother died from pills 5 years ago. Afterward, I tried to keep my mother alive by becoming useful enough for both of us. It felt like love until I realized I was angry every time she still hurt." Elowen's anger faltered. Rowan looked back at her. "You are not weak. I think you are strong enough to mistake a life raft for land." She got out without answering. Inside, she placed her wedding ring on the kitchen table and stared at it until midnight. The ring looked brutally small under the kitchen light. She had expected removing it to feel like an event, like betrayal, like a door slamming inside a church. Instead, it looked like metal. It looked like something she could hold, lose, polish, misplace, place in a drawer. That ordinariness frightened her more than the symbolism. At 2 in the morning, she put it back on. At breakfast, she took it off again because the skin beneath it had gone pale and soft. By noon, she had placed it on a chain around her neck, hidden under her sweater, where no one could see the compromise. Vivian called that afternoon and asked whether Elowen had decided which framed picture to use for Miles's birthday dinner. Elowen closed her fingers around the ring beneath her shirt and said, "Whichever one you prefer." Vivian said, "I thought the one from the coast. He looks so alive there." Elowen looked toward the studio window. He was alive there. Vivian fell silent for a second, wounded by the bluntness of tense. "Of course," she said softly. "That is what I meant." After they hung up, Elowen felt cruel, then angry that accuracy could feel cruel, then exhausted by the fact that grief made even grammar dangerous. Vivian saw Rowan at the studio on a Thursday afternoon and made the room colder without raising her voice. She had come by with a tin of cookies and a stack of old photographs for Elowen to look through when she felt ready, a phrase that meant Vivian had decided readiness could be arranged by delivery. Rowan was replacing a cracked pane near the high window. Miles's apron had been taken down again, this time because Elowen had washed it properly and could not decide where to hang it. Vivian stopped just inside the doorway, her eyes moving first to Rowan, then to the empty peg, then to Elowen. "I did not know you were changing the studio." Her voice was mild. That was what made it dangerous. Elowen wiped her hands on her jeans. The window was rotting. It needed repair. "Of course." Vivian turned to Rowan. "Thank you for helping." "Mom," he said, stepping down from the stool. Vivian's politeness was flawless. She asked who he worked for, how long the repair would take, whether the old frame could be saved. Each question seemed harmless until Elowen felt herself shrinking beneath their accumulation. Then Vivian looked again at the peg. "Miles kept his apron there. I washed it," Elowen said. "It was full of dust." Vivian's lips parted slightly, as if dust had been promoted to relic. "He liked it there." Rowan looked down and began gathering his tools, not fleeing, but removing himself from the center of a conversation that was not his to control. Elowen felt anger rise, not at Vivian exactly, but at the way the dead kept being used as witnesses against ventilation, cleanliness, repair, laughter. Vivian, it was dirty. Vivian's face trembled once and the anger in Elowen collapsed under guilt. I know, Vivian said. I know it is foolish. I just came in and for a second the room looked less like him. There was no accusation in the words which made them harder to survive. After Vivian left, Elowen found herself hanging the apron back on the same peg, still damp at one corner. Rowan had not yet gone. He stood near the open door, rain light behind him. You do not have to put it there because she cried, he said quietly. Elowen turned on him with more force than he deserved. You do not know what she lost. No, he said. I know what she is asking you to lose with her. The sentence landed like a slap, not because he intended it, but because it was true. You should go, she said. He nodded, picked up his toolbox and left. Elowen remained in the studio until dark, staring at the apron, hating Vivian, hating Rowan, hating herself most because she had no clean place to put the truth. In the days that followed, Vivian's presence expanded in the house without Vivian being there. Elowen began noticing how many choices she made as if Vivian stood behind her. She did not buy the new blue dish towels because Vivian might see them and remember the old ones Miles chose. She did not move the boots because Vivian might ask where they went. She did not tell June about the dinner with Rowan because the story would sound like a step, and steps required justification. Vivian called often, sometimes with practical reasons, sometimes with grief disguised as errands. Could Elowen check whether Miles's old glazed notebook had the recipe for the green bowl Vivian loved? Could she bring one of his mugs to the church auction display? Could she come to dinner on his birthday? Could she send a photo of the studio shelves, just because I miss seeing them? None of these requests were cruel in isolation. That was the genius and tragedy of them. Vivian never said, stay still so I can survive. She said, I miss him. She said, you are the only one who understands. She said, it comforts me to know the studio is still there. And each sentence placed another small sandbag against the door Elowen was trying to open. June noticed the change before Elowen admitted it. You are moving around your own house like you are renting it from Vivian's grief, she said one afternoon at the bakery. Elowen snapped, she lost a child. June slapped dough onto the counter harder than necessary. And you lost a life. Stop ranking wounds just because hers makes more people uncomfortable. Elowen had no answer. That night she stood by Miles's boots and whispered, what am I supposed to do with you? The boots, being boots, did not absolve her. Arthur Hart, of all people, opened the first real door. He called Elowen on a Sunday and asked if she could come by for some boxes of Miles's old receipts and studio files Silas had found in the garage. Vivian was at church committee, he said, and something in that detail told Elowen he had chosen the time deliberately. Arthur's workshop smelled of machine oil, brass, dust, and old wood. Clocks lined the shelves, some ticking, some silent, all of them in various states of being persuaded back into time. On his bench sat a mantel clock with its glass face removed. This one stopped the week Miles died, Arthur said, not looking at her. Vivian wanted me to leave it, said the silence felt appropriate. He adjusted something inside the mechanism with a small tool. For a while I agreed. Elowen stood near a shelf of clock hands sorted by size. What change? Arthur smiled without humor. I kept looking at it and realizing I was not remembering my son. I was remembering the moment he stopped. His hands paused. There is a difference. Elowen could not speak. Arthur set the tool down and finally looked at her. He had Miles's eyes but without the quick spark, as if grief had sanded them matte. Vivian loves you. That does not mean what she asks of you is always love. Elowen's throat tightened. She lost her child. Yes, his voice roughened. And you lost your husband. These are not the same wound, but they are both wounds. Hers does not get to eat yours. The workshop filled with ticking. Arthur lifted the clock's pendulum and set it moving. The sound began unevenly, then settled. Keeping a room unchanged does not bring the dead back, he said. Sometimes it only teaches the living to forget where the door is. He gave her the boxes. At home, Elowen carried them into the kitchen and left them untouched until midnight. Then she opened the first. Receipts from winter fairs, clay invoices, a sketchbook, a stack of class ideas in Miles's messy handwriting. At the bottom was a sealed envelope with her name on it. L. Not Elowen. L. The handwriting made her sit down too quickly. She held the envelope for 10 minutes without opening it. The fear was not that Miles had written something cruel. It was worse. She feared he had written something alive, something that would contradict the clean ghost she had used to discipline herself. She put the envelope in a drawer. Then she took it out. Then she put it back. She called June and hung up before the first ring finished. She called Rowan and ended the call before it connected. The envelope remained in the drawer for 6 days, pulsing in the kitchen like a second heart. During those 6 days, Elowen became a woman split into tiny negotiations. She would open the drawer, see the envelope, close it, then clean something that was already clean. She scrubbed the stove knobs with a toothbrush. She alphabetized the studio invoices. She watered the basil twice and killed it with attention. She wore the wedding ring again because the envelope made her feel watched. She took it off to shower and then cried because the pale circle beneath it looked like an accusation from skin itself. She dreamed of paper. She dreamed Miles had written only one sentence, "You remembered me wrong." She woke angry at him, then guilty for being angry, then angrier because guilt had become the house's most reliable weather. Rowan came by to drop off a replacement latch she had ordered weeks earlier. She met him on the porch instead of inviting him in. "You look like you have not slept," he said. "That is not a romantic thing to say." "I was not trying to be romantic." She almost smiled, then stopped herself. "There is a letter," Rowan waited, "from Miles." His face changed only slightly. "Have you read it?" "No." "Do you want to?" "No." "Do you want not to?" She hated him for asking better questions than she did. "I want it to stop being possible." He nodded as if that made perfect sense. Unopened things can become louder than opened ones. She looked at him. Does wood teach all carpenters to be irritatingly metaphorical? Only the bad ones. For 1 second the air between them warmed. Then she stepped back into the house and closed the door before warmth could require interpretation. During those 6 days, her connection with Rowan grew both gentler and more dangerous because it began to involve ordinary time. He took her to see an old house his organization was restoring on the east side, a narrow Victorian with stripped floors, walls open to studs, and morning light falling through windows not yet painted. He showed her where water had damaged the sill and where a previous owner had covered rot with trim. "People like hiding damage if the room photographs well," he said. Elowen ran her hand along a beam. "Potters do the opposite. Fire reveals everything." They ate sandwiches in his truck while rain tapped the roof. He told her about his brother in pieces, not as a tragedy offered for intimacy but as fact. Nadia had found him. Their mother had blamed herself. Rowan had spent years fixing gutters, painting rooms, repairing porch steps for people who did not ask, because if enough houses stayed upright maybe one family would not collapse. Nadia, his sister, called him out on it often. Elowen listened and felt the difference between confession that asks to be managed and confession that simply opens a window. Rowan did not want her to heal him. That made her want to move closer. It also made her afraid of how much she wanted. One afternoon he pulled a splinter from her finger, with tweezers, his touch light, his head bent close enough that she could see sawdust in his hair. Her body remembered desire not as lightning, but as warmth returning to a room after the heat had been off for years. That night she dreamed Miles stood in the studio with his back to her. He was not angry, that was worse. He was simply turned away, hands in the pockets of the jacket from the morning he died. She called his name in the dream, and he did not answer. She woke and vomited into the sink. By dawn she had taken his old sweater from the closet, put it on over her nightgown, and started Kiln Nights on the speaker for the first time. The songs filled the kitchen like a haunting she had invited. When Rowan came by because they had planned to look at the kiln vent, she met him at the door and said, "Do not wait for me." He looked tired, not surprised. "Is that what you want?" "It is what is fair." "Fair to whom?" She gripped the doorframe. "I do not know what this is. I do not know if I like you or if I like feeling less dead beside you." Rowan's jaw tightened, but he did not step in. "That is an honest thing to say. It is also a cruel thing to say, yes." She wanted him to argue, to insist, to take the burden of decision from her by becoming either hurt enough to leave or devoted enough to fight. He did neither. "I will not be a replacement," he said. "And I will not become a bridge you stand on forever because you are afraid to touch the ground." Tears burned her eyes. "You make everything sound clean." "It is not clean." His voice roughened. "I like you enough to want to make it clean. I know better." He left and Elowen hated him for not saving her from the thing he had just named. That afternoon she did not go to the studio. She stayed in the kitchen wearing Miles's sweater until the smell of it made her sick, because it was no longer him. It was closet, dust, cedar block, the stale air of preservation. She wanted to call Rowan back and accuse him of cowardice for refusing to fight. She wanted to call June and say everyone was asking her to be alive before she had finished being dead. She wanted to call Vivian and confess everything so Vivian's devastation could punish her properly. Instead she sat at the table, opened the drawer, placed Miles's envelope in front of her, and did not open it. The restraint no longer felt like love. It felt like fear, and fear, once named accurately, became harder to respect. Miles's birthday dinner at Vivian's house was the night the empty chair became unbearable. Vivian had cooked his favorite meal, roast chicken with rosemary, potatoes too crisp at the edges because Miles had loved them that way, green beans with almonds and lemon cake. His chair remained pulled out slightly from the table as if he had just stepped away. No plate sat there, but the space had been arranged with care, a negative presence. Elowen wore the black dress again because she had not had the strength to choose otherwise. Arthur looked at the chair once and then at his wife with sadness so familiar it had become part of his posture. Vivian asked about the library, about the studio, about whether Elowen had found the old Christmas ornaments Miles made in college. Then, halfway through dinner, she said, "Arthur mentioned someone has been helping you at the studio." Elowen's fork stopped. "A carpenter. Rowan." Vivian folded her napkin in her lap. "Are you seeing him?" The room changed temperature. Arthur looked down. Elowen could have lied. For 2 years she had protected Vivian from every sign of movement. She could have said no, not really, just repairs. Instead she heard June's voice, Arthur's clock, Rowan's boundary, the sealed envelope in her drawer. "I am getting to know him," she said. Vivian's face remained composed for 1 second, then 2, then cracked just enough for devastation to show. "Already?" The word was soft. It made 2 years collapse into indecency. Elowen felt shame flood her body. "Vivian. No, I am sorry." Vivian set down her fork with care. "I know you are young. I know Miles would not want you alone. Everyone says that. Miles would want Elowen happy. As if anyone knows what the dead want when the living are tired of grief." Elowen flinched. Arthur spoke before she could. "Vivian, no, let me say it once." Vivian's eyes filled. "I lost my son. You were his wife. When I look at you, I still see him having a place in the world. If you move on, where does he go?" Elowen's breath caught because the question was not manipulative in the cheap sense. It came from the center of a mother's ruin. That was why it could trap her. Arthur looked at the empty chair and said quietly, "The chair should not eat the rest of her life." Vivian turned on him, stunned. "How can you say that?" Arthur's voice shook. "Because I have been watching it eat yours." Vivian began to cry, not prettily, not with control. Elowen stood, then sat, then stood again. There was no right action. No one in that room was wrong enough to hate. No one was right enough to follow. She left before dessert, carrying Vivian's grief like wet wool over her shoulders. At home, she opened the drawer, took out Miles's letter, and sat at the kitchen table until dawn before breaking the seal. The letter was not a farewell. That almost made it harder. It had been written during the week they fought about expanding the studio, folded and never given, probably because Miles had intended to revise it, and then forgot, as he forgot many things. It began, and the sight of that shortened name in his hand made her press the paper to her mouth. He wrote that he was sorry for pushing the studio forward faster than she wanted. Sorry for making every dream into a plan with numbers attached. Sorry for assuming that because she was cautious, she was less brave. He wrote that he knew she carried the unglamorous parts of their life, the invoices, the supply lists, the quiet worry, and that he sometimes hid behind charm because people liked him better before they saw the mess he left on the table. He wrote that if he died young, which he acknowledged was a dramatic thing to put in a marital apology, and therefore very on brand for him, he wanted her to promise not to turn the studio into a monument to his unfinished ideas. The line made her stop breathing. "What I love most about you is not that you loved me," he wrote. "It is that you make useful things from earth. Things people hold. Things children can paint badly and proudly. Things that survive breakfast. If I am ever not there, do not let my absence become the most important thing in the room." Elowen bent over the table and made a sound so raw it frightened her. Miles had not given her permission to love Rowan. He had done something more devastating. He had returned himself to her as a man, not a saint. A flawed, funny, self-aware, maddening man who knew the danger of being worshipped after death. The letter did not free her. It accused her gently of using his name to keep the room still. She read it once, then again, then a third time with anger rising so violently she nearly tore it. "You do not get to say that now," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "You do not get to leave me with all this wisdom after leaving me with all the bills and the orders and your mother and your boots and the stupid shelf you promised to fix." The anger broke open something cleaner than guilt. She cried with her forehead on the table. Not as Miles's faithful widow, not as Vivian's last living connection, not as the woman who kept the house intact, but as a wife furious at her dead husband for being right too late. The next day, Silas Hart came by with Miles's old phone and a charger he had found in a box of fair supplies. Silas was younger than Miles by several years, an anxious, kind man who had avoided Elowen for months after the funeral because he cried whenever he saw her. "There are some files," he said. "I did not watch all of them, it felt weird. But there is one video I think you should have." He stayed while the phone charged, both of them sitting at the kitchen table like people waiting beside a hospital bed. The video was shaky, shot in Miles's van the morning before the winter fair delivery, rain spotting the windshield. Miles's face filled the frame at a bad angle, one eye squinting, hair damp, voice cheerful and tired. If I forget to say this later, after this fair I am taking a week off. Hold me to that. No orders, no heroic kiln schedule, no talking about money before breakfast. We are going to fix the stupid shelf, make one ugly batch for fun, and maybe remember that the studio was supposed to be ours, not a hungry animal we feed with our marriage." He laughed, then glanced at the road. "Also, if you are watching this because I forgot to show it to you, remind me not to become the kind of husband who turns everything into a plan. You hate that. You are right to hate that." The video ended mid-breath. Elowen slid from the chair to the floor. Silas began crying, saying he was sorry though he had done nothing. Elowen cried because Miles's voice had not sounded holy. It had sounded alive, distracted, imperfect, returning to her from a morning that did not know it would become final. The ghost cracked. The man remained. After the letter and the video, Elowen became harder to reach before she became freer. People imagined revelations as doors opening, but sometimes they opened onto rooms full of everything one had been avoiding. She cancelled plans with Rowan. She avoided June. She ignored Vivian's calls because she had no strength to be a battlefield for two forms of grief. She spent days in the studio reading Miles's letter again and again, then raging at him for being dead, then apologizing to the empty air for raging. She placed the cracked cup on the work table, then moved it back to the shelf, then moved it again. She took down the apron, folded it, unfolded it, hung it on a different peg, then sat on the floor because the change felt enormous and ridiculous. Rowan came once, stood in the doorway and did not enter. "I need time," she said. "I know. I do not know if I love you or if you just arrived when I needed proof I was not buried." Pain crossed his face. "I know that too." She wanted him to fight for a simpler answer. He did not. Nadia Bell visited him that week and met Elowen briefly in the studio yard. Nadia was direct in a way that reminded Elowen of hospital lights. Later, Elowen overheard part of her conversation with Rowan near the truck. "You like broken houses," Nadia said. Rowan replied. "She is not a house. No, but you know how to make repair feel like love. Be careful." Elowen expected Rowan to defend himself. Instead he said, "I am trying." Nadia's voice softened. "Try by not making yourself necessary." That sentence stayed with Elowen because it named the mercy Rowan had been offering her all along, and the danger beneath it. He could stand near the door, but he would not become the door. That made her angry, then grateful, then lonely in a way that was finally hers. She began opening boxes, not all at once. There was no cleansing montage, no triumphant clearing of shelves. She moved like someone learning the weight of each object after a long illness. Miles's boots went into a cedar box after she cleaned the dried mud from one sole and then sobbed because the mud felt like the last place he had stood. His jacket went to Arthur, who held it against his chest and said nothing. Some tools stayed. Some duplicates went to a community workshop. She kept the brown mug but moved it from the sacred place beside the sink to the open shelf where mugs belonged. When Vivian came and saw the apron no longer on the central peg, her face went pale. Elowen did not apologize. "I washed it," she said. "I folded it. It is in the cabinet with the other aprons." Vivian's lips trembled. "It feels like losing him again." Elowen's voice shook, but she did not step back. "I know, but keeping it dirty did not keep him here." Vivian turned away, one hand over her mouth. Arthur, who had come with her, placed a hand on her shoulder. Vivian did not accept the change. Not then, but she did not demand it be undone. That counted, in grief, as a kind of earthquake. The middle of that summer was the cruelest part because nothing looked dramatic from outside. There were no shouting matches, no betrayals clean enough for a court of friends, no single scene where Elowen could say that was the day everything changed. Instead, there were small repetitive collisions that wore her down. Vivian would arrive with a framed photograph and ask where it might still belong. June would ask whether Elowen had eaten and then pretend not to see when she lied. Rowan would pass by the studio with a toolbox and leave before she could ask him to stay, honoring the boundary so well it sometimes felt like abandonment. At work, patrons would ask whether the Hart studio might ever reopen, and Elowen would answer, "I am considering it," as though considering were not a room she had lived in for years. At night she listened to the video until Miles's voice became less like a visitation and more like a document. She began to hear his impatience, his fatigue, the road noise, the turn signal, his human carelessness in recording something while driving. The more real he became, the less useful he was as a punishment. That was its own grief. Saints can be used to deny life. Men cannot. The night Elowen reopened the kiln, rain fell hard enough to make the studio roof sound alive. There was no audience except the people who had earned the right to stand near the heat. June sat at the work table sorting a tray of lopsided practice cups Elowen had thrown badly that week with hands stiff from disuse. Arthur stood near the shelf, adjusting the small repaired clock he had brought because he said every working room needed at least one honest measure of time. Vivian came late, wrapped in a gray coat, her hair damp, her face guarded. She looked immediately at the shelf where the cracked blue cup now sat, high enough to be safe, visible enough not to be hidden, ordinary enough not to rule the room. Her eyes filled, but she said nothing. Rowan stood outside under the awning because Elowen had asked him to wait there until she called him. She had not done it to punish him. She had done it because she needed to know the first act of opening belonged to her, not to the man who came after. The studio smelled different now, not new, not healed, but disturbed. Dust had been swept, the vent had been checked, the shelves were repaired. Miles's apron rested folded in a cabinet beside Elowen's. On the table lay the letter, sealed again in a plastic sleeve, and the phone video copied onto a drive Silas had labeled in black marker. Elowen stood before the kiln with her hand on the switch. For 2 years she had believed the room would accuse her if she brought it back to life. Instead, it waited with a patience that felt almost merciless. Vivian whispered, "I do not know how to do this." Elowen turned. The two women looked at each other through all that Miles had been, and all that he could no longer mediate. "Neither do I," Elowen said, "but I cannot keep making this place a room where everything alive has to ask the dead for permission." Vivian pressed a hand to her mouth. "He was my son. He was my husband." The words were not competition, they were boundary. Elowen's voice broke, "And he was a person. Not this silence we keep feeding." Arthur lowered his head. June wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. Vivian looked at the cracked cup. "I am afraid if things change I will lose the shape of him." Elowen nodded. "I am afraid if nothing changes, I will lose the shape of myself." No one answered because no answer could improve it. Elowen turned back to the kiln and flipped the switch. For a second nothing happened. Then the old machine clicked, hummed, and began to warm. Metal expanded with tiny sounds like a body stretching after a long confinement. Elowen gripped the edge of the table. She did not feel free. She felt gutted. The heat did not resurrect Miles. It did not erase the road, the rain, the phone call, the police officer's eyes at the door, the brown mug, Vivian's empty arms. The mornings Elowen poured coffee down the sink. It only proved that something could continue while all of that remained true. After several minutes, Elowen opened the door and called Rowan in. He stepped inside slowly, rain on his shoulders, and stopped just past the threshold. He did not stand near Miles's old stool. He did not touch the cup. He placed a small cedar sign on the work table. Hart Clay Room. Not Miles Hart Studio. Not Elowen and Rowan. Not a new claim over an old wound. Hart, because it had been Miles and Elowen and the work and the history and the pieces that might still pass through living hands. Elowen touched the letters. Her face crumpled, not from romance but from recognition. Rowan said, "I can take it back if it is wrong." She shook her head. "No, it is not wrong." Vivian stared at the sign for a long time, then at Rowan. "Thank you," she said, and the words cost her more than politeness ever had. But the night did not become warm after that. No one embraced in a way that solved what had been broken. Vivian left early because the heat from the kiln made her cry, and she did not want anyone watching. Arthur followed her, one hand hovering near her back without touching until she allowed it. June stayed to wash cups that did not need washing. Rowan stood near the doorway, careful as ever, and Elowen suddenly hated his care because it revealed how fragile the whole room still was. "You can come in farther," she said. He looked at her. "I am in as far as you asked." "That is not what I meant." "I know." The exchange hung between them, unfinished. She wanted to ask him to stay the night. She wanted to ask him to leave. She wanted to be the kind of woman who could choose without turning the choice into a memorial. Instead, she said, "Thank you for the sign." He nodded. "You are welcome." Then he left too. Elowen spent the rest of the night beside the kiln, listening to heat build in the old machine. At 3 a.m, June fell asleep with her head on folded arms at the table. Elowen covered her with Miles's old work jacket, then stood there, looking at it on someone else's shoulders, and felt no lightning strike of guilt, only sadness, heavy, real, survivable. A year later the studio opened on Saturdays, not triumphantly, not as a rebirth anyone could photograph without lying. Some mornings no one came, Some afternoons children filled the room with too much noise, made cups with walls too thick, painted everything purple, and left clay fingerprints on the door Rowan had repaired. Elowen taught them how to center the clay, though her own life still often felt off-center. June brought pastries once a month and pretended it was marketing. Arthur installed the repaired clock on the shelf beneath the cracked cup. Vivian came sometimes and sat stiffly near the window, watching children use the tools Miles had once held. At first she cried every time. Later she cried only sometimes. She still touched the blue cup when she entered, but she no longer asked for things to be put back the way they were. Elowen no longer wore her wedding ring every day. She kept it in a small wooden box with Miles's letter and the drive holding the video. Some mornings she opened the box and felt the old world rush up so violently she had to sit on the floor until it passed. Some nights she still dreamed Miles was waiting for her in the studio, not angry, not forgiving, simply there, unreachable. Rowan remained in her life, but not as an answer. For months after the kiln night, they stepped back. He came by to repair the classroom table, to drop off cedar scraps for student projects, to drink tea on the back step, then leave before grief could confuse gratitude with commitment. Elowen hated the slowness and needed it. She had to learn the difference between wanting him and needing rescue from an empty room. Rowan had to learn the difference between loving her and becoming necessary. Their love, if that was what it was becoming, had no clean beginning after loss. It moved carefully among objects that still had names. One cold spring morning, Rowan arrived with cedar boards to reinforce the long student table. Elowen opened the studio door before he knocked. The room behind her was warm from the kiln, smelling of wet clay and coffee. Sunlight came through the high window and caught dust in the air, turning it briefly gold. The cracked cup sat on the shelf, the clock ticked. A child's crooked bowl dried near the sink. Rowan looked at her and smiled with the restraint of a man who had learned not to treat presents as possession. "Morning," he said. Elowen stepped aside. "Morning." He lifted the boards. "Where do you want these?" She looked around the studio, at Miles's cup, at her own wheel, at the sign, at the table scarred by years of work and disuse and work again. "Here," she said, "for now, later." When they stood beside the open door drinking coffee, Rowan asked nothing about the future. Elowen was grateful and sad about that in equal measure. She looked out at the wet yard, the repaired door, the bowl under the downspout still catching rain. "I do not know what to call us," she said. Rowan leaned against the frame. "Then do not call it yet." She looked at him. "That sounds like something people say when they are afraid." "I am afraid," he said. "I just do not want fear to do the naming." Elowen nodded. That was as close to a promise as either of them could bear. The ending did not soften for her. Miles was still dead. Vivian was still a mother without her son. Rowan could still leave one day or be taken or change or fail. The studio could burn, the kiln could crack, the body could betray, the road could turn slick under rain. Love had not made the world safe. It had only made hiding from the world impossible. Elowen opened the studio door wider, and cold morning air moved through the room, lifting a faint veil of clay dust from the work table. She did not feel healed. She felt awake, which was harsher. She had not been given back the life she wanted. She had been returned to the life that remained, and somewhere inside that unfinished, frightening, breathing life she understood that loving Miles forever and stepping toward Rowan were not opposite acts. They were simply two truths standing in the same room, painful, imperfect, neither asking the other to disappear. She turned on the lights, set the kettle to boil, and began preparing clay for the children who would arrive at 10. The cracked cup watched from the shelf, not as a command, not as a wound kept open for proof, but as part of the room at last. Outside, the rain bowl filled and overflowed. Inside, the kiln held its heat. But even that was not a clean ending, because clean endings belonged to stories people told from a safe distance. There were still mornings when Vivian called and Elowen let it ring, because she could not carry one more careful grief before breakfast. There were still afternoons when a child laughed in the studio, and the sound struck her with such sudden resemblance to Miles that she had to step outside and grip the railing until the world steadied. There were still nights when Rowan drove away after tea, and Elowen watched his taillights disappear with a loneliness so sharp it tempted her to call him back for the wrong reasons. There were still days when she missed the museum, because museums were quiet and living rooms were not. Yet the door opened now. That was the only miracle the story allowed her. Not happiness, not replacement, not release. A door that opened, a kiln that heated, a cup that stayed cracked and did not have to be thrown away. A woman who had loved a dead man enough to almost bury herself beside him, learning slowly and without applause that survival was not betrayal, though it often felt just as cruel.